We're in real trouble.
Why? What's happening?
Moments after takeoff,
The aircraft began to shake and rattle.
We're going down, Larry. I know it.
a 737 plunges into the frozen Potomac River.
I thought I was going to die in that airplane that day.
A Washington news team captures breathtaking video.
It's not fair. This woman's gonna die right in front of us.
The images shock the nation. With limited evidence to go on,
I don't seem right.
The reporter doesn't tell you anything about the engines.
Forward.
investigators need to try something new.
Forward.
Lose the crew voices.
They turn to an ingenious plan to solve the mystery of Air Florida Flight 90.
He should have trusted his instincts.
Mayday, Mayday.
January the 13th, 1982. Planes at Washington's National Airport are snowed in.
The weather conditions that day in Washington, D.C., and particularly out at National Airport, were very difficult. It was snowing, and it was cold. It was down around 24 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a rather miserable day, and as the day progressed, the snow increased.
It's 2:15 p.m. The 74 passengers on board Air Florida Flight 90 should be in the air by now. But their plane is still at the gate.
We should have rebooked when we saw the weather.
We might still make it.
Joe Stiley is a businessman and private pilot. He and his secretary Nikki Felch are traveling to Florida on business.
By and large, everybody realized that it was one of those days. It was a snowy day. The chances of getting out were 50-50 maybe.
Airport crews are working to clear the snow. For now, no one takes off or lands.
You know, in Washington, National Airport only has one runway, and so they don't have the option of removing snow on one runway while they're using the other and then switching back and forth the way many airports do. When they need to close the one runway, the airport's closed.
Flight 90 is commanded by Captain Larry Wheaton.
60 degrees in Tampa and we're stuck in a snowstorm.
Definitely be good to get home.
His first officer is Roger Pettit. Florida is home for both men.
We know passengers hate delays. They just hate them. Well, the pilots hate them too. And the air traffic system hates them because it's just a massive inconvenience for everyone.
Also on board, Bert Hamilton, a purchasing manager from Maryland. He's heading to Tampa on business. Priscilla Tirado is moving to Florida to start a new life with her husband Jose and their infant son.
It's just de-icing fluid.
I guess we need it.
2:45 p.m. The plane gets de-iced. If they can keep their wings clear of snow and ice, the pilots should be able to take off as soon as the airport reopens. After an hour and a quarter,
Tower.
National Airport finally reopens.
Reopening now. Copy that.
Okay, showtime.
Controllers now face a massive logistical puzzle.
Eastern 133, taxi into position and hold.
Eastern 133, position and hold.
There are more than 20 planes waiting to take off or land.
There would have been a lot of people talking at once trying to figure out, you know, when am I going to get released? When am I going to go?
162.
Greenland 1625. Turn left, taxi, and hold. Winds are 010 at 10.
That's the kind of thing that creates a lot of anxiety in the air traffic control tower.
804, we clear to land.
Stand by, please, 804.
You've got 40 or 50 airplanes on the ground, and they're all trying to be the first one out.
Eastern 1551. Keep it at reduced.
That puts an extra strain on both the ground handling folks and also up in the control tower.
Okay, Palm 90, you'll be falling in line behind
Apple DC-9.
Palm 90. Behind that apple, I guess.
Captain Wheaton will take off behind a New York Air DC-9. As the Air Florida 737 taxis to the runway, flight attendant Kelly Duncan makes a final cabin check.
Apple 58, cleared for takeoff. Traffic's 3 south.
For the runway. Apple 58, takeoff.
I think we might get to go here in a minute. Ought to get to work. Stabilizer trim set at 5.3. Set. EPR all the way to 204. Set.
556.
Cleared to land.
Clear to land, 556.
A Palm 90, taxi into position.
Am you ready for an immediate takeoff?
Palm 90.
Ladies and gentlemen,
We've just been cleared on the runway for takeoff. Flight attendants, please be seated.
We got something over the loudspeaker from the crew indicating that we were scheduled for departure.
I thought we might never get out of here.
Palm 90, cleared for takeoff.
Palm 90 cleared for takeoff.
your throttles.
Okay.
Today, First Officer Pettit will be flying the plane. Captain Wheaton will monitor their instruments. The engines spool up quickly.
Oh. Ooh. Really cold here. Real cold.
The plane soon has enough power to accelerate down the runway. They can't get airborne until they reach takeoff speed, 139 knots.
Yeah, look at that thing. That don't seem right. Does it?
Yes, it is. There's 80.
Huh? Maybe it is right.
120.
Joe Stiley is a pilot who's familiar with this airport. He can tell that something's wrong.
I got real nervous about halfway down the runway.
B1.
When the plane lifts off, Stiley's sense of doom gets worse.
When we got airborne, almost instantly it was clear that that aircraft was not flying normally. And I turned to Nikki and I said, we're in real trouble.
Why? What's happening?
All of the dishes, cups, glasses that were in the galley started to rattle, shake, and make a very loud noise. And the aircraft began to shake and rattle.
The stick shaker activates, warning the pilots the plane is losing lift.
Easy.
Captain Wheaton urges Pettit to push the nose of the plane down, a key step for regaining lift.
Forward. Forward.
Joe Stiley prepares for the worst.
Just do what I do.
I put my head down, and I saw people around me staring at me, and then a couple of them took the example that I gave.
Come on, up. Forward. Forward. Up. Barely climb.
Less than a minute after takeoff, Air Florida Flight 90 is falling to the ground.
Stay down. Keep your head down.
The crew increases engine power, but it's too late.
Larry, we're going down, Larry. I know it.
The plane hits a bridge over the Potomac River.
Felt like almost like we rotated at 90 degrees, like we were going to somersault or something like that. And then we hit the water. And that was a real impact, much greater than the one with the bridge. And I felt myself blacking out. I thought I was going to die in that airplane that day.
Air Florida Flight 90 is sinking beneath the ice of Washington's Potomac River.
When I regained consciousness, I was actually sitting upright in my seat, and the water was starting to come into my mouth and nose. I had a broken foot, broken ankle on both sides. So I got my leg loose. Then I did the same thing to Nikki's right leg. I got her out of, she had a summer problem. And I just pulled her by the hand and started heading aft and went over the seats behind me.
Of the 79 people on board, 6 escaped from the shattered wreckage and reached the surface.
I knew I was out of the aircraft when it ceased to be totally black.
The plane has left a trail of destruction on Washington's 14th Street Bridge. 4 people were killed in their cars. 4 more were seriously injured as the 737 slid from the bridge into the river below. The fate of the passengers and crew is still unknown. Word of the disaster soon reaches news cameraman Chester Panzer.
The assignment desk called on the radio and said, "We heard something about a small plane crash at National Airport."
Come in, Chester. Are you there? There's been a crash at National Airport. We want you to check it out.
I started speeding down the highway.
By the time Panzer arrives at the crash site, rescue teams are already at work, including a helicopter from the U.S. Park Police.
We grabbed our gear out of the trunk. We could hear a helicopter faintly in the distance. We connected our umbilical cable from the camera to the recording deck. We could see a flashing light. And I started rolling. And the first thing I saw was someone being loaded into an ambulance.
It's Bert Hamilton, the purchasing manager from Maryland. He's the first passenger rescued from the Potomac River. The rest of the survivors are still battling the icy waters. Flight attendant Kelly Duncan reaches for the rescue line. Beside her, wearing a life vest, is Secretary Nikki Felch. Priscilla Tirado has lost her baby and can see no sign of her husband. She clings to businessman and private pilot Joe Stiley.
Once I surfaced there, I looked around, and that airplane was gone, except for this little piece of it that I was holding on to.
Barely visible to the camera is one last survivor, Arland Williams. He's badly tangled in the wreckage and urges the others to take the lifeline first.
There was a fellow who was strapped into his seat right in front of us who couldn't get out because a bunch of cables and things like that had gotten around him, and he was just wired in place there. And then I turned to Nikki and I said, "I'm all broken up and I know I can't swim. My legs aren't working."
There was a big gaping hole in the ice with big cracks, and it looked like someone had taken a baseball, thrown it through a window.
I looked up and there were probably, it seemed like 10,000 people up on that bridge and along the sides of it looking at us. And we were out there freezing to death. All those people standing up there and nobody could do anything.
The river is near freezing and filled with thick ice. It's too dangerous for rescuers to enter the water. Panzer keeps rolling as the helicopter lifts a second person from the river. It's flight attendant Kelly Duncan.
She was holding on, and the helicopter was just flying her in.
In the numbing cold, Joe Stiley does his best to help two other passengers, Nikki Felch and Priscilla Tirado.
I had Priscilla in a kind of an arm lock on this side, and I had Nikki on this side, but this arm wasn't working very well. And the helicopter began to pull us away into the water. I lost Nikki almost instantly because this whole arm just was dysfunctional. And I had Priscilla under that arm for about halfway across the river, and we started running into the broken ice. I was coming up into those ice packs, one pack after another, and all my ribs ended up being broken. At some point during that, I lost my grip on Priscilla and left her laying there on top of a block of ice.
Joe is pulled to safety, but Priscilla Tirado is now stranded and alone. The helicopter drops Priscilla a life ring.
I watched her be towed off. I saw her lose her grip on the lifeline.
That's when it hit me, and that this woman was going to drown in front of me. She was in the open water, and she's being pushed under the water by the helicopter wash.
Then one bystander decides to take action.
He didn't think about how cold the water was, didn't think what it would do to him.
It's a federal government employee named Lenny Skutnik.
He really was a hero in that he had enough guts to do it and just didn't think about the consequences.
Lenny reacted. Nobody else did. They were probably all standing around. I wanted to react, but I couldn't.
Skutnik's bravery saves Priscilla's life, but her husband and baby are among the dead.
And the paramedic reaches out and grabs Nikki Felch, and he just grabs a hold of her, hoists her up onto the skid the best he can. And he's not even secured into the helicopter. He's basically balancing himself, so it's pretty amazing.
It's now been 45 minutes since Flight 90 plunged into the icy river. Too long for anyone to survive in the freezing water.
Nikki Felch was the last one to be pulled out of the water.
Only 5 people make it out alive. Within hours, NTSB investigators are on the job. Flight 90 has crashed a little more than a kilometer from the runway. The location tells investigators the plane didn't gain much altitude, but little else.
All we knew was that it seemed to have hit in a flat attitude, which would indicate some problem of control, but we didn't know what exactly caused it.
Yeah.
At the airport, they gather as much information as they can.
It was quite a day, snowing pretty hard at times.
About how the weather affected the flight.
So we were closed for about an hour and a quarter while they cleared the snow off the runway.
The first thing you look at is the weather. Environmental conditions are always one of the prime considerations when looking at initial causes of any accident.
Investigators learned that Flight 90 was delayed for more than an hour while the airport was closed. If ice and snow built up on Flight 90's wings during the delay, it could have prevented the plane from climbing. Ice and snow can interrupt the flow of air over the plane's wings, decreasing lift.
The importance of de-icing the aircraft is very paramount. Even a small amount of contamination can affect the performance of a wing, whether it's a light aircraft or a heavy aircraft.
They examined de-icing records from the day of the crash.
They were very, very interested in how efficient that de-icing had been.
Air Florida's procedures called for a powerful de-icing solution. one designed for very cold days.
Basically what happens is that the de-icing fluid dissolves the snow and ice sort of into a mixture. So when it's first put on at sort of full strength, it's doing quite a good job.
Records reveal that the de-icing fluid sprayed on Flight 90 was not full strength.
They homed in on the issue of the equipment itself, the mixture that was used, the procedures that were followed.
De-icing fluid has to be adjusted according to the outside temperature.
It's just de-icing fluid.
If the mixture wasn't strong enough, it might have allowed ice to reform on the wings.
Want to pass me that weather data, please?
Investigators study temperatures recorded at the airport during the long shutdown. They find that the fluid used should have worked.
They figured they'd go right behind.
Though it wasn't full strength, the mixture was strong enough for the temperatures recorded on the day of the crash.
Sloppy work, but shouldn't have caused the crash.
Other aircraft did depart, which means that things were successful in other jetways. What was wrong with this particular aircraft that caused a crash?
Investigators need hard evidence to figure out what brought down Air Florida Flight 90. But most of it is still underwater.
In this case, the wreckage was in the river. And the river was a murky one. It was a frozen one. Consequently, the recovery was extremely difficult. The tail came up, other pieces came up, but it's an exhausting process. Engines are knocked loose from the aircraft, and parts are here and there and scattered. So it's quite difficult to put everything together.
A week after the crash, investigators get a break. Flight 90's black box flight recorders have been recovered from the bottom of the river, and they appear to be undamaged. In 1982, the Flight Data Recorder, or FDR, captures only a handful of parameters about the performance of the plane. But it's enough to give NTSB investigator John McAdle a vital clue.
Let me know when that's ready.
It told us the altitude and the time, and so you knew how long it rolled down the runway before it lifted off.
Flight 90 takes 45 seconds to get airborne, 15 seconds longer than usual.
Takeoff was very slow.
That don't seem right, does it?
It took a long time to accelerate.
It's got to be something about their engine power.
The plane eventually had enough power to reach liftoff speed.
B1?
But it did not have enough power to climb.
It didn't climb in a normal way. So obviously, there was something wrong with the amount of the power.
It's an intriguing clue, but the FDR doesn't have enough information to reveal what the problem was.
The recorder doesn't tell you anything about the engines, or what their RPM is, or what they're doing.
McAdle hopes the cockpit voice recorder will provide some answers.
Boy, this is bad. It's probably the worst snow I've seen.
The pilots of Flight 90 comment on the wintry conditions as they taxi in line behind a DC-9.
It's been a while since we were de-iced.
Tell you what, my windshield will be de-iced. Don't know about my wing.
McAdle listens as Wheaton and Pettit discuss removing ice from their plane's wings.
Oh, all we really need is the inside of the wings anyway.
The wingtips are gonna shuck all that other stuff.
They know that returning to the gate to be de-iced again would mean another long delay.
If you have to leave the line, you're going to come back and have to rejoin a big line of aircraft waiting departure. So that's one of the issues that weighs on a captain's decision as to whether to depart the line up or not.
Gonna get your wing now.
It seems the captain comes up with an unconventional strategy to de-ice without losing his place in line. He maneuvers his plane into the exhaust streaming from the DC-9 in front of them.
They pulled up in back of another aircraft, a DC-9, thinking that they might be able to warm up and blow off their aircraft.
The DC-9's engines expel a 100-kilometer-an-hour blast of 300-degree heat.
Did they get yours? Can you see your wingtip? I got a little bit on mine. A little? This wing's got about 1/4 to 1/2 inch on it. All the way.
It's a disturbing conversation. One that suggests these pilots were experimenting with an unofficial procedure. But so far, McAdoo has heard nothing that explains a loss of engine power.
Your throttles? Okay.
Then he hears something chilling.
Oh. God, look at that thing.
While the plane is speeding down the runway, the first officer tells the captain that he suspects there's a problem.
That don't seem right.
Does it? There's 80.
But the captain convinces him nothing is wrong.
Huh? Maybe it is right.
I think he felt that they weren't accelerating very quickly. You can feel acceleration in your back, you know, when you're an experienced pilot, you know, you've done this 1,000 times. You know, if you're not moving as quickly as, you know, it's really a feel thing. Something's not right.
He should have trusted his instincts. Yeah, let me hear that again.
Investigators wonder if the pilots made any other mistakes.
Palm 90, taxi to position, and be ready for an immediate takeoff. I think we might get to go here in a minute. Thought it could work.
The amount of power or thrust needed for takeoff is different for every flight. It has to be adjusted for the weight of the plane, the length of the runway, and the weather conditions.
Stabilizer trim set at 5.3. Set.
Investigators hear the first officer set a target or bug to remind him what that amount is.
EPR all the way to 204. Set.
Perhaps the first officer set his target too low for the plane's takeoff weight. If he did, it could explain why the plane gained speed so slowly.
V1.
And why it didn't have enough power to climb.
The engines could have been running, but not with enough power or thrust to maintain the airspeed required to get the lift that you needed to stay off the ground.
The weight of the plane was recorded before the flight. Investigators use this to calculate how much power Flight 90 needed to get safely off the ground.
Everything checks out. They weren't overweight. Come on, I've got an idea.
With little data from the FDR, McAdoo comes up with an unusual way to analyze the power coming from Flight 90's engines.
I don't recall it ever being used in any other accident or available for any other accident.
He hopes to figure out how much power the engines were providing by analyzing the sound they made. Jet engines contain turbines that make different sounds depending how quickly they're spinning. When the engine needs more power, the turbine spins faster, and the frequency of the sound changes.
You ready to go? Yeah.
The sound of Flight 90's engines should tell McAdoo how much power they were generating. And thanks to the unique design of the 737, with its engines mounted close to the cockpit, he already has a recording of the sound he needs.
It's unique in that the sound of the engines is recorded in the background on the cockpit voice recorder.
They play back the cockpit voice recorder in a soundproof room.
120.
V1.
We did a digital sound analysis of the cockpit voice recorder, which can eliminate all other noises except for that frequency of the engines on the cockpit voice recorder.
Can you take the stick shaker out? lose the crew voices.
Forward! Forward!
The technician eliminates the other sounds in the cockpit one by one, until all that's left is the sound of the engines.
It's a pretty scientific and detailed issue to look at blade passing frequencies and outside noise and compare it to a normal takeoff. But all this was done by the flight recorder specialists and technicians.
Can you turn that up a bit?
The results are dramatic.
Those engines sure ain't at full power.
The sound analysis indicated that the engines were running at a speed that would produce about 70% power. What this means basically is that the aircraft was taking off with about 1.5 engines.
Investigators now know that the Boeing 737's engines weren't running at full power during takeoff. What they don't know is why. A key piece of wreckage may hold the answer. It's the engine pressure ratio gauge, or EPR, which is connected to a sensor at the front of the engine. It measures the increasing pressure of air passing through the engine to calculate thrust.
Your throttles? Okay.
The gauge tells pilots when they have enough power to climb. If it was malfunctioning, it might have given the crew a faulty reading.
It's a real-time physical indicator of thrust.
The first officer had doubts about the EPR gauge.
God, look at that thing. That don't seem right. Does it?
But the captain made the mistake of focusing only on his speed.
Yes, it is. There's 80. Well, maybe it is right.
A close examination of the EPR gauge reveals something strange.
Can't be right.
The needle of the gauge is frozen in its final position, and it's displaying an impossible reading.
They indicated the engines were producing more power than the engines were capable of producing. That was a huge red flag.
Your throttles?
It now seems likely that the gauge was showing the wrong reading throughout the short flight. The question is, why?
Pilots were seeing more power than they were getting, so what would have caused that?
Here.
Investigators begin to suspect that the weather may have played a role in the accident after all. They focus on the EPR sensor at the front of the engine. If the tiny sensor was blocked with ice and snow, it might have sent incorrect data to the cockpit.
I think we're going to need another plane.
McAdoo has no hard evidence that the sensor was blocked, but he decides to follow a hunch.
I got a hold of another 737 because I already suspected the engine pressure ratio gauges.
He uses a piece of tape to simulate the effect of ice blocking the engine sensor. He recreates the actions of the pilots on the day of the flight.
Okay, start her up.
And he records the sound of the engines from inside the cockpit.
Keep throttling up.
He increases power until the engine gauges match the target set by the crew of Flight 90.
Got it. Let's see if I'm on the right track.
Blocking the sensors on the test flight should create the same reduction in engine performance as on Flight 90. Both engines should sound identical.
Okay, let's see what we've got.
McAdoo compares the sound of his test flight to the engine noise captured during Flight 90's takeoff.
That's a perfect match.
So I concluded that both engines were blocked with something, probably ice, but they were blocked, and the pilots were reading what was required for engine thrust, but that's not what they were getting.
Investigators are convinced the crew failed to give the engines more power because the iced-over sensor led them to believe they already had enough. By the time they realized their mistake, there was no way to stop the crash.
They did apply full power, but that was only about 5 seconds before impact. It was too late.
The 737 has an engine anti-icing system that uses heat to keep the sensor clear of ice.
Stabilizer trim set at 5.3. Set.
EPR all the way to 204. Set. Anti-ice. Off.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've just been cleared on the runway for takeoff.
Unbelievable.
Flight attendants, please.
One of the worst snowstorms, and they have their anti-ice turned off.
The investigators found that to be astounding, that they had replied to anti-ice, engine anti-ice, with a rote answer of off, and that both people accepted that.
It seems the two Florida-based pilots were following their usual warm weather routine.
Off. They were in the Florida mindset. They weren't in the cold weather scenario mindset at that moment when that call out and reply were made in the cockpit.
But McAdoo still has a question. A 737 is designed to take off with just one working engine. Even with the reduced power, Flight 90 should have been able to get off the ground.
There was still a problem because the aircraft was designed to take off with one engine after it reaches a certain speed, which it did. So there had to be something besides the engine power.
Investigators study the pilot's records. They learn Captain Wheaton has a history of mistakes.
Huh. What have we here? Captain Wheaton. Look at all the unsatisfactories.
He's been reported more than once for failing to follow procedures, especially during takeoffs and landings.
Unsatisfactory adherence to regulations, checklist usage, pre-flight, unsatisfactory, flight procedures, unsatisfactory.
The captain's history of poor decision-making helps explain his unusual maneuver on the taxiway.
What they really did was get some warm air on a part of the leading edge of the wing, and any snow that was clinging to it ran back as water and refroze as ice.
Did they get yours? Can you see your wingtip? I got a little bit on mine. A little? This wing's got about 1/4 to 1/2 inch on it all the way.
Consequently, they did a lot more harm to their aircraft.
Investigators believe the ice on the wings degraded the plane's performance only slightly. When combined with low engine power, though, it was enough to rob the pilots of the lift they needed to climb. The only remaining question: why was the crew willing to take such a dangerous risk?
It's been a while since we were de-iced.
Tell you what, my windshield will be de-iced. Don't know about my wing.
Investigators believe the inexperienced pilots may have underestimated the dangers they were facing.
They were Florida. Neither pilot was real used to flying in snow or, wintertime conditions.
Oh, all we really need is the inside of the wings anyway. The wingtips are gonna shuck all that other stuff.
The captain had, I think it was 8 takeoffs in that kind of weather. The first officer who was going to make the takeoff as a pilot flying had 2 experiences. So regarding the ability of the flight crew to understand all the ramifications of the existing environmental conditions, they were literally unqualified.
The pilot's poor judgment and inexperience proved to be a deadly combination when they confronted the vicious snowstorm in Washington.
The captain knew things were wrong. He didn't want to stay there in Washington. He wanted to get out of town.
B1?
The NTSB's John McAdoo has uncovered the precise sequence of errors that led to the fatal crash.
Your throttles?
Okay.
Pettit begins pushing the thrust levers forward, aiming for the target of 2.04 EPR. Because the EPR sensors are blocked with ice, the gauge shoots up quickly and gives the crew a false reading.
Oh.
The Air Florida pilots are unaccustomed to winter flight.
Really cold here. Real cold.
And attribute the unusual engine behavior to the cold.
We hear the co-pilot articulating concern.
God, look at that thing. That don't seem right. Does it?
And yet it's not acted upon by the captain.
Yes, it is. There's 80.
The captain should probably have said, hey, wait a minute, let's abort this takeoff and let's figure out what's wrong with these engines.
V1?
Seconds after liftoff, the stick shaker activates, warning the pilots that they are losing lift and beginning to stall. The first officer tries to regain lift.
Forward, forward.
But with ice on his wings, it's impossible to recover.
If they had applied power about 10 seconds earlier, they could have flown through it.
We're going down, Larry. I know it.
The accident occurred because of accumulation of numerous decisions that were made by this particular flight crew.
It became apparent that whoever was flying that airplane wasn't doing it properly, and I knew that halfway down that runway. And I thought, what a shame, because we're all going to get killed. And most of us did.
On January the 13th, 1982, a series of errors by the pilots of Air Florida Flight 90 left 78 dead, 5 survivors, and 1 hero. For his brave rescue of Priscilla Tirado, Lenny Skutnik is honored during President Ronald Reagan's State of the Union address and is given a standing ovation from Congress. In honor of the man who died during the rescue, Washington's 14th Street Bridge is renamed the Arlen D. Williams Jr. Memorial Bridge. The Air Florida disaster was a wake-up call for better flight safety in winter conditions.
There were so many things that the pilot community was able to learn from this accident.
After the Air Florida accident, you simply do not take off if you have any contaminant on your wings. It's almost unheard of to try that.
In the aftermath of this accident, northern airports around the world improved de-icing facilities so that pilots can de-ice near the runway just before takeoff. Powerful technology now clears runways faster, helping airports avoid long delays after a heavy snowfall.
Today we've got this new multi-function equipment that's got brooms and blowers and plows all in one big $1 million piece of equipment.
Since the Air Florida disaster, pilots and regulators better understand the risk of winter flight.
Unfortunately, it took the Air Florida accident to bring a lot of focus on this issue. Icing has been with us since Lindbergh, who iced up as he went across the Atlantic, and it will continue to be with us as we proceed in the future.
How can witness statements about a violent argument help experts solve the mystery of Britain's worst air crash? Air Crash Investigation is back after the break.